The topic of vulnerability has been coming up a lot in my sphere lately, with a few people sharing with me, different people in completely different scenarios, sharing things like they're afraid to be vulnerable at work and have a conversation that feels important for them with their boss or with a colleague or someone that they work with. There are also those who have an issue with or are experiencing challenges with vulnerability when it comes to asking for what they want with people that they are friends with or in relationship with or want to be in a relationship with. But really it comes down to the same kind of communication principle, I guess. I lean a lot on Brené Brown's work, especially when it comes to vulnerability and shame, just because there can be the element of when we feel vulnerable, there's fear, right? There's the fear of, I don't know what's going to happen. I feel exposed. What do I do with this? All of that kind of fear. And there is also the element of shame in vulnerability, which is whether or not it should be there, which is if I am vulnerable and if I share this thing, then there's a shame around that. For some reason, there can be a shame story where it becomes I'm needy and I'm asking too much, or it's not my place, I shouldn't have said something, or whatever it is. It can all kind of add on. And I've dived a fair bit personally into this topic, into vulnerability, into shame and shame stories. And one thing I've learned, again, through reading and watching and listening to a lot of Brené Brown, but also through my own work with therapists, with friends, trusted friends that are doing their own work, that shame in itself is it's insidious, right? It can exist in the dark, and that's often where it grows and it thrives. And but as soon as you shine light on the shame, it can't exist anymore, at least in that level, in the way that it's impacting you. So if you are able to bring yourself to a space where you can acknowledge, I have a shame story around this, that acknowledgement in itself makes a big difference in the impact that that shame story has on you. Often it kind of dissipates or dissolves a little, simply with that acknowledgement. And I've tested this out myself, and I've explored that myself, and it's really powerful, the difference that makes. But then there's the element of fear and vulnerability as well. It can be really scary to open up and share something either about you or about what you want, especially when there is the potential risk of the answer being no, or the answer being something that you didn't want the answer to be. And again, Brené Brown really puts this well, but basically vulnerability cannot exist without courage and without that element of something that makes us feel scared. So there are no elements where you feel courage, for example. Let's go the other way. There are no elements of when you feel courage where vulnerability doesn't play a role in that. So to feel courage, there has to be an element of vulnerability and showing up and acknowledging that. And the reality is, my reality is, that if you keep letting the fear of vulnerability dictate your decisions in life, or what you ask for, or what you talk about and ask about, or what you inquire into, or what you even let yourself explore, if you let that fear of that vulnerability dictate all of those things, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get to create the life that you want. You're going to stay stuck playing small. And then there's a whole host of other challenges that come along with that. For me, it's if I feel like I'm playing small or feeling stuck, it's a frustration. It's a let me out of here. Like, this isn't what I'm about and what it should be and all of that. So when it comes to vulnerability, what I like to explore personally and with those that I train, so especially within the workplace, if you're feeling vulnerable about sharing or having some kind of conversation, especially the ones that feel important to you, usually it's those ones that we feel the most vulnerable about. If you are feeling vulnerable about things, I invite you to name it. So if you're in a meeting and it feels safe to name it, which is a different element of the safety to share it. But if you feel safe to name that you feel vulnerable in a meeting or in a conversation, in a personal conversation, it's really across the board how you can use this. But if you feel safe to, you can name it and say, look, this makes me feel really vulnerable to share. Like, I'm feeling really vulnerable and I want to talk about this, but there's an element of it that is feeling that way for me. And you can word it however your language and words are, but I recommend the general message of naming what it is to the other person, and notice what that does to the room. Often, in my experience, I've never really experienced it to be in any other way, but often when you name it like that, when you say, this feels really vulnerable for me to share or to talk about, but it feels important to me to still do so, there is a softening in the room. And I don't mean a weakening. Soft is not weak, but there is a softening in the energy of the room, in the receptivity of the other person or between the two of you, that allows this opening up. And by you naming it and acknowledging that particular thing, it then gives them permission to show up in the same way. And especially in workplaces, we have our defenses up hugely. We have this sense of we need to be defensive at work. We need to have our barriers, our walls up, because we don't know who's safe, what's safe, all of that stuff. And that's a whole different conversation about why that can be. And to a very large degree, I absolutely understand that also. But the thing with naming, when you feel safe enough to name, I feel vulnerable sharing this or trying to talk about this, even if you haven't shared it yet or talked about it yet, naming that sense of vulnerability, naming that feeling, it gives the other person permission to step into that level with you of sharing, that level of vulnerability, which is where we then open up even more. We create more of a sense of connection, which means that we get the job done a lot better because we don't have those defenses in the way, especially in our communication barriers. It becomes more about, this is what's going on now, let's actually really share on a real level and forget about not forget about the protective mechanisms, but acknowledge them, but put them aside enough to still be able to share. And it may still be challenging, but there's a different permission that you give yourself and that you give other people when you step into that space and acknowledge and name, this is vulnerability for me. So see how that works for you. And like I said, it works in all different contexts, all different kinds of relationships and communication that you have, whether it's in the workplace, amongst your team, with your partner or your friends or your family or anyone that you're sharing on a personal level with. Notice what that element of naming things actually does for you.